Right, we'll kick off. My name's Nick Robbins from the Just Transition Finance Lab. It's great to invite you here for this session on what's next for global policies, finance and just transition. Recently, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the era of global boiling has arrived. And it certainly arrived in this room. So thank you very much for making it here this afternoon in this hot and steamy London Climate Action Week. We are going to have a great discussion looking at the evolving ideas of just transition. We're here to launch a new report mapping justice in national climate action, co-authored by Jodi-Ann Wang and colleagues Tiffany Chan and Catherine Hyam there. And I'm going to go through that, set the scene, and then we will have a panel discussion with three distinguished panelists, exciting panelists, who will heat up the discussion, and then we'll have opportunities for you in the room and also online to ask questions. We have Sharon Burrow, former General Secretary of the International Trade Unions Confederation, also the chair of our Strategy Council of the Just Transition Finance Lab, Catherine McKenna, former Environment Minister in Canada, and chair of the high-level expert group on net zero policies, and many other things, and also on our Strategy Council. Emily Amin, Managing Director at British International Investments, UK's Development Finance Institution, and also Head of Climate and Diversity at BII, who's going to bring some of the finance experience. So we will be running until about 5:30. We hope this to be a really interactive discussion, really looking at what the state of play is on just transition, themes of justice, where finance can play, and how we really scale up finance for a just transition in the months ahead, and particularly maybe looking to the COP. So Jodi-Ann, if you want to take us off, just to kick us off.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I will spend the next 15 minutes or so telling you a bit more about our latest policy output, which is meant to kind of paint a picture on where the global narrative around just transition policy and justice in climate action currently lies. The just transition is happening, not without its contention. It's being mainstreamed over the past few years, not only because we're seeing this as a very important agenda item in multilateral climate negotiations, as well as on the ground, in real life, where in recent years we've seen how extreme weather events are threatening livelihoods of people, and particularly workers and informal workers in certain geographies. So justice is happening, and so is escalating injustices. And our report wants to conduct an empirical review of essentially questioning if countries are saying we care about the just transition, the fair transition, the equitable transition, what do they mean by it? So this report is an empirical review with policy documents that was extrapolated from our Climate Change Laws of the World database. We took 159 policies and laws from 61 countries and the EU to actually look at what is this framing and articulation of justice. And the methodology we apply is actually the 17 key search terms that you see here on the screen. So even if countries don't use the word just transition, quote unquote, for various reasons, including the politicization of it, we can still try to understand exactly what they're doing and what they mean. And I think here it's important to caveat that we've had questions in the report being published around, well, where does the term human rights sit? And our understanding is that it's foundational, it's fundamental to the just transition, and that if we use the word human rights as a key search term in our database, it would have mined out a lot more policy reports for the scope of the study. But we saw that human rights is very much part and parcel and embedded in the just transition conceptualization. Again, as I said, it's very contentious, it's very complex, but complexity does not mean impossibility. And what we want to do is to kind of unveil where the complexity lies so we can find common grounds. And the first step, the first analysis, the first finding we need to understand is what is justice? What justice are we talking about here? And also, whose just transition is this? Just transition for whom? And with credit and thanks to the work that the Institute of Human Rights and Business has done on kind of defining some of the justice concepts here, what we've done is we applied the definitions and to look at exactly where countries are sitting on what they're prioritizing in terms of different justice concepts. There's a lot of discursive fluidity to the idea of justice. For example, when it comes to distributive justice, that's about the fair distribution of risks and opportunities to different groups while being cognizant of race, gender, and class lines. On procedural justice, that's really about people who have been traditionally marginalized and are affected stakeholder groups in this transition. Where is their agency and their seat at the table when it comes to decision-making processes? And we have more systemically focused types of justice, like restorative justice, with 18 hits here that really looks like not only looking forwards, but looking at historical context and redressing historical damages while the just transition is under its way. And things like ecological justice, which was the least kind of number of findings in our report, looks at non-human beings in the ecosystem and the justice for them, because we're seeing countries increasingly enshrining things like the rights of nature and the rights of environment in the transition discourse as well. So as we see, distributive justice and procedural justice are by far the most common, and others less so. And here it's important to emphasize that justice means different things to different communities depending on the context in which they have developed, the demographic characteristics, their economic development, their historical contributions to climate change. So we don't expect for all countries to focus on all types of justice, but having this layer of complexity allows us to understand where common ground and potential fault lines lie. And what this tells us, especially in the policy sense, is that policymakers need to actually, before the process begins, collect more information about what specific types of justice or injustice exist, how they need to be addressed, before determining the policies. Otherwise, we may weaken the ability for stakeholders to get behind the entire agenda. And all that is not meant to be easy. If it was easy, we wouldn't be here. There's a lot of tough questions, uncomfortable situations, unpalatable realities of the status quo that we need to confront in the transition, and all of that needs to be dealt with in due course in order for justice to mean something to the people who are affected. And speaking of people, the question of just transition for whom? We know the broad concepts of workers, communities, consumers, supply chains, but there's also a layer of granularity that came through in our analysis, where depending on your demographic characteristics, children and youth became very prominently featured as an affected stakeholder group in some policies, while others, for example, the US, really had an emphasis on communities of color, given the the historical context, and countries like Turkey having climate migrants and migrants in general as a specific affected stakeholder group, given their role in the migration routes and the increasing climate migration and displacement that we're seeing as the circumstances get worse. Different interpretations of justice also, I suppose, would mean different things in the way that texts are being kind of presented in our analysis. So for example, on the left here, we see Canada's national adaptation strategy. We're seeing terms like environmental justice named, we need to prioritize certain populations and communities who are at risk, the historical and undergoing practices, and the process need to be transparent and inclusive. And these are ways for us to understand what type of justice countries are mentioning. While others, for example, like Bolivia on the right here, take a much more transformative and system-focused approach, where this text here translates to it's also the transitions about decolonizing and depatriarchalizing. Is a revolution focused on decolonizing, depatriarchalizing based on visions and knowledge of indigenous people, which is entrenched in the process of a more plurilingual dialogue with participation from different stakeholders. And we see in the case of Bolivia, the just transition is very much about defending the rights of Mother Earth at all levels. Just to give a taste of kind of how different countries are approaching this. The way that countries define what justice means, I mean that there's different types of change that they're trying to induce, and on the right, and this typology that we adopted in our analysis, everything ranging from more status quo managerial type of reform, which is to say kind of voluntary programs, bottom-up, corporate-driven changes, that looks at mostly almost more often than not at a firm or specific entity level, versus the more structural reform, transformative type of change that seeks to redress and address historical forces of oppression, how they all come together to marginalize certain specific groups. And the solution to have more transformative change really looks at kind of ownership structures and what needs to be changed, the type of institutions that exist at at play and really dismantling these interlinked systems of oppression. As you see with the number, we see a more status quo type of approach. That's not surprising, that's expected. Why? Because in the current socioeconomic system and our policy making, having more managerial status quo approaches are more efficient in terms of cost, time, identifying responsibilities and delegating responsibilities, as well as the policy instrument that's used. We're more comfortable with it, they're more easily identifiable, costed, and the intended outcomes is more easily quantifiable. Whereas, especially in the case of finance, we go to more transformative approaches. We really need to rethink and redefine some of the concepts that business as usual has brought us here in the first place. Things like value and risks and assets and profits that sooner or later we may realize are kind of incompatible with how we're defining fiduciary duties today. And I think before moving on to this role specifically about finance, all that is to say, for us to be able to understand more about what transformation means, I think there's a really important role that think tanks and research institutions can play to provide that testing ground. The just transition is not free. Now moving on to finance. And that's very clear because in our analysis, public finance, particularly public finance, is the most prominent policy lever that governments are relying on in order to make the just transition happen. And countries are exercising or proposing different types of policy levers when it comes to finance in a mix. And to seek their complementarity, we really didn't see countries relying on one single policy to get us through this challenge. And I think that's really important to emphasize here. And another caveat to say is our analysis rests at looking at what policies are saying they want to do in terms of just transition. We're not analyzing the extent of implementation and the outcomes of the implementation. That's very much something we want to do after this report. We also found that several policy packages put forward more integrated investment plans for financing the just transition so as to create a more coherent narrative for a wide array of financial actors. However, a few other findings on disclosure. We didn't see a lot of policies mandating just transition related disclosure obligations for non-state actors, despite the now mainstreaming for private actors to disclose climate-related financial risks and opportunities. We know a lot of these are coming online in recent years, and we also know that even if they're not in regulatory force yet, there's a whole proliferation of just transition guidelines around disclosures. For example, the UK Transition Plan Task Force, among many others. We're also seeing blended finance mechanism being referenced, and we'll see examples of that in text in a moment, but I think there needs to be more understanding around the justice implications of blended finance so as to not socialize the risk and privatize the gains. And this is very important in terms of just transition discussion, especially in multilateral climate negotiations, where it's not only about the need for finance, but the quality and the type of financing instrument can make or break a just transition. And I'm sure our panelists will touch on that during the panel as well. This is kind of to give you a taste of kind of exactly the mapping that we were doing to look at the keywords that were being mentioned. So here on the top right, we see with procurement as a policy in the US was really ensuring that procurement opportunities are available on an equal basis, aligning to the executive order around advancing racial equity. In Korea's New Deal, we saw the examples of employment insurance systems coming online. Ireland's budget touched on the use of proceeds from carbon tax and different fiscal instruments to protect and support lower income households and also communities in precarious situations. And in the case of South Africa, in the Just Energy Transition Plan, the more integrated investment plan, we saw the mentions to green taxonomy, which has a social element built into it, and also the climate budget tagging pilot. More specifically on private finance, Romania's plan touched on the use of private finance towards reskilling and improving workers' competencies. In the US as well, we really saw the action verb around jumpstarting and stimulating private investment. And lastly, in the case of Zambia, the example of blended financing for coming about using DFI's provisions to leverage additional private finance. So we've used our report to kind of paint a picture, and as part of our theory of change, we really need to understand the landscape so as to move towards the ideas of financial system transformation. We know that the justice is being mainstreamed, but we're seeing that there are fragmentations when it comes to approaches, definitions. Their communications are insufficient or sometimes not enough to bring stakeholders behind the agenda, and the co-creation process is not yet clear. So there's a lot more to do, but it helps us understand the landscape a bit better, and also gives us understanding around what this means then moving into implementation and what it means for just transition on a global level. Most recently at SB60 in Bonn, where the first dialogue on the Just Transition Work Program happened and negotiations on the new climate finance goal are underway. We really see the nexus of just transition and finance coming together, where it's about the means of implementation, and it's also about the quality of financing, questioning whether certain types of finance should be counted towards just transition or should be counted in the definition of what the new climate finance goal should be like. And also, this is, I think, a timely conversation started, to say the least, as countries are preparing their next rounds of submissions for the nationally determined contributions. We try to answer some questions. There's also a lot of questions that remain unanswered, including that we'll try to answer in the time ahead, which is about the systemic nature of this just transition, the systemic nature of finance, and how these two areas meet, and how we can have a just transition that's not for some people, but for everyone. And I hope this provides a scene-setting discussion that we move into the panel. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jodi-Ann. Thanks very much. A great mapping exercise, and thanks to our colleagues from the Factories as well. This really sets us up for the panel discussion, and then really also for you, many brains in the room in terms of just transition and finance and global action, and I'd really like to bring you in. So here's just some time for you to get your thoughts together, and also for those online as well. So I'm going to kick off really just to ask our panelists sort of your first sense about the findings of the report and what you find most striking about the state of national sort of just transition policy, which Jodi-Ann has set out. Maybe Catherine, start with you, then Sharon afterwards.
Sure. Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Jodi-Ann. And it's great. I'm a graduate of LSE so many moons ago. It's great to be back here, actually, hopefully adding to the discussion, the conversation. Look, I think I was approached everything as a practitioner. Like, I'm not an academic. I was Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Minister of Infrastructure, and now working on net zero, real net zero, like to deal with greenwashing and what do corporates and financial institutions, as well as cities and regions, need to do. So that's my hat that I wear when I look at this. And I think this report is really important because I think everyone's struggling. Like, you know, a lot of countries want to do just transition policies, but they don't really know what should be included. I worked with Sharon on Canada's first just transition policy. It was focused on coal communities. And I think what you pointed out, that what is justice, is really important because there are very different views of justice, but there's also very formal views. So governments and policymakers are often up here. And when we were doing our just transition, like we went to communities, and Labour went to communities and got yelled at, right? Like they weren't, when coal phased out, they weren't like, oh, this is amazing. They were like really worried and angry, but also like kind of intrigued that government would actually come. And I think that what is really important as governments do this, and we think about justice, and the question that is posed, it was really important, justice for who or whom. And it's not bad. I think it's good to be very inclusive. So there are very broad views of justice, but sometimes when we think of just transition, we need to be thinking about the communities and workers that are in those communities. Otherwise, you're either going to have buy-in or backlash. Those are the options. And so formally, you can have the nicest things on paper, but what are you really talking about? Are you really listening to these communities? And are you really thinking about co-creating these policies, which you talked about? Because if you don't, writing the best things about justice, whatever kind of justice you're talking about, whether it's distributive justice, whether it's like more formal justice, or it's justice for particular groups, it doesn't really matter because it's not going to work. And so that's what I think. I think it's really good to be focused on that and have people really have to think, okay, what are we formally, like in this policy, what kind of justice are we talking about, but then taking it one level down, and is that actually delivering justice for those most impacted, and that can be Indigenous communities, like in Canada, definitely Indigenous communities are impacted. But you know, the workers and the communities that will be, for example, part of the phase out of coal, they're not part of the discussions now we have on paper. They need, you know, they have views, which is not surprising about what justice.
Very good. So this focus on procedural justice, that actually getting people involved in the process is key. Sharon, your reflections on what you've heard?
Well, I'd just say here to Catherine's point, and I thought in the paper, the definitional pieces around justice were really helpful because you can then characterise in conversation with the actual workers community, you know, whether or not they see the process as just. Most of it will be distributive and procedural. In fact, I would argue that before you can even get to the distributive, you have to have the trust building of the procedural justice development, and that's what just transition is. If you're not co-creating a future, then trust is so vulnerable now in communities, in governments. People don't trust institutions at all levels. And Catherine's right, they're fearful. I mean, the worst thing about change is not the change itself. People don't necessarily want their kids to work in coal mines, don't. But what they do want, they don't want, you know, communities where you can't breathe. But what they do want is a guarantee of security and opportunity for the future. If they're at the table, genuinely moving the agenda so that it's enabling them to see a stake in the future and they can take responsibility for themselves and their communities, then you're going to have a much better chance. I was struck by the ecological justice piece, and I think it's really helpful to have it in there, not to skip over the rest, Jodi, but because as we move to say, well, how do we put people and nature at the heart of a planetary boundaries environment where our economies are actually putting people and planet at the centre, then the rights that are being ascribed in law now to many areas of the environment, as indeed, you know, rivers, lakes, forests, etc., as Jodi says, is both helpful, but actually if we don't see it in context with the communities and how you put the responsibility back on the actors who are actually damaging or failing to repair the communities, then, you know, we will again not build that trust in a sustainable future. My final point would be on the financing. I actually think all of the mechanisms of financing are critical, but again, they have to come back to, are they serving the purpose of the agreement between, you know, corporations, governments, workers and communities? And blended finance, of course, is going to be part of the future. Our treasuries don't have the capacity to keep stumping up money, but they can do a lot to actually build the seed funding base of making sure, I mean, some of them talk about governments de-risking, that's part of it, but it's also about saying, how do you actually use seed funding to build the kind of asset management or collective wealth building that we know is possible. But the other part about financing, and, you know, I'm like a broken record on this, but if you do not price in the externality of financing and nature, but certainly financing, just transition and nature, but certainly just transition to every project, every outcome. And as Catherine and I were plaguing poor old Jodi this morning, and Rowan and Nick, but about how you make sure that it's transition out of dirty industries and environments, but it's transition in where you can. Place-based development is the best, but where you can't transition in, because we're dealing now with a whole of economy piece. It's an industrial revolution. It's got huge opportunities, but of course it's got huge threats if we don't get it right. So I think this is a very helpful discursive frame that gives people some normative points of debate, and it also is informative for people themselves to say, well, where do we see justice lining up? as agency in the process.
Great, Sharon, thanks so much. And we'll come back and go into more detail on the finance side. But Emily, just your first reactions on the framing and the analysis. You've been looking at just transition, I think, for a while in your work.
Yeah, exactly, and with yourself, Nick, for some time now. And so just to, I mean, I think many people will be aware, but in case you're not, we're UK's Development Finance Institute, but also an impact investor. So everything we do, everything we look at, we're looking to deliver impact. We only invest in Africa and Asia, and particularly the aim to try and invest as much as possible in the poorest parts of those regions as well as countries. And so the just transition actually for us was almost a natural focus as we developed our climate strategy. Our approach was how we think about Paris alignment. Even back in 2020, when it wasn't really so well, it certainly wasn't as much in the discourse as it is now. I mean, it was certainly, I know, particularly from Sharon's work and the work that I'd done in my previous role at Multilateral Development Bank, including with Nick, was very aware of this concept. But I think from a private sector impact investing perspective, it was really quite a new concept. And I think we took this focus on, as Sharon said, the transition in. And one example, and in fact, there's a case study produced for the lab, for the Just Transition Finance Lab, of one of our investments in India, Ayana, a renewable energy developer that we invested initially some equity in that company. We worked to grow that company. We built their ESG standards. A big part of that was the community development, community engagement. You can read the details of exactly what their community development plan looked like in the case study. But we also then want technical assistance to train women in particular to be able to work in these companies. They're sort of utility scale renewables, so helping women to become engineers in the renewables sector, so have senior management roles. So this was very much part of what we were doing. We weren't actually, and that was in 2018, we weren't referring to that as just transition, but as we developed our understanding of just transition, we started to realize that was a very good example. And I think what's really interesting based this report is the fact you've looked at these different interpretations, and that I think resonates quite well with some further work we actually found in India when we collaborated with Nick and Analyst, but also with to look at develop a just transition finance roadmap for India. But we also have been engaging with some South African, the trade and industrial policy strategies think tank TIPS, who were very involved in developing just transition and interpreting what a just transition finance roadmap looks like for South Africa. And I remember one of the very early sort of findings in India was that they were concerned that we were trying to take the definition of just transition in South Africa and trying to say, well, this now is your own interpretation. And it became very clear early on that actually, no, we needed to really work with different stakeholders, and particularly the government that needed to really themselves start to come to their own understanding of what just transition means and looks like or could look like in practice. So I think that's really helpful, that the way in which you set that out, and the importance of recognizing that different governments will have different priorities, but also cultural differences that may mean they interpret what a just transition means actually in practice.
Fantastic, yeah. So we have global principles, but very much sort of nationally determined applications. Just sort of going in a little bit more in depth, really thinking about what are the key features of sort of promising and effective national policy for just transition. Again, I'm going to turn to the former minister, Catherine, to kick us off for that. We've heard about sort of different interpretations, but we really want to think about what makes policies effective at the national level. And then we'll do into more about finance and international. Catherine, on the sort of national level.
Sure. I mean, I think what came out in the report, I mean, there's no one size fits all. So every country is extremely different. So I live in Canada. Some days it feels like we're, very, very focused on oil and gas, and there's a particular context in Canada that makes it very challenging. We can talk about just transition on coal. We did. Talking about transitioning out of fossil fuels is an extremely challenging conversation. And just one very particular thing that may apply in other contexts or not is being very careful even about the language you use. So just transition is not language that goes well in Canada, because what do people hear, at least people in the communities? They hear that government is going to take their jobs away and then hypothetically find them a new job, which they don't believe. So that's not a good story, and that's not what anyone is really talking about when the government or folks talk about we talk about just transition, but you have to be, recognize the context. And by the way, there are entrenched interests that are quite interested in that kind of storyline, that they feel like they can talk about their economic interests. So oil and gas companies can talk about their economic interests as if that's the same as interests of workers and communities, which, by the way, governments and people have to do a way better job to talk about the differences between that, because actually, I'll do a little rant here, but oil and gas companies, they make as much money as they can. They give most of it back in shareholder dividends. They invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure. And in Canada, it's outside of Canada, the dividends. And then, they get rid of workers because they want to reduce costs. That is just a thing. And then they demand subsidies to clean up their pollution. So it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. And so I think governments have to be brave and strong and say, actually, we believe in Canadian workers, and we believe in these communities. And so, I think that also requires, we talked about this co-creation, it requires really consulting. And by the way, that's hard. Like when we did this, we had labor and we had business and folks that went to these communities, and going into a hall of 700 people in, rural Saskatchewan, not easy. Everyone doesn't wake away, isn't like welcome you, isn't welcome you with open arms. And so, you have to be humble, and you have to listen, and you have to hear things that are hard to hear. I don't think they're that surprising. And as Sharon said, you go to the communities and the feedback, I wasn't doing it, but the feedback I got from folks that did it is that I don't know that people were really surprised. And actually, many of their kids didn't want to go work in coal mining, but they wanted a job for their kid, and they wanted to put food on the table, and they wanted their community to thrive, and every single business was indirectly or directly related to the mine. So that's a big charge to try to figure that out. So I think, the consultations in our case were actually not bad. Thank God we had Sharon, and we had really great people, including unions and labor. That was super, super important. But I think where we felt a bit short, and I guess the government I'm not in the government, might be unhappy to hear this, but I think that the reality is it requires money, and it requires looking at things from a transformative way. And I felt at some points there was finance was like, well, everyone all sorts of industries go through transition. And I was like, oh, no, we're actually single phasing our coal. That means these jobs aren't going to exist. There are other opportunities, but we need to actually be working with the communities to deliver that, and that requires money. And so I think that is really important. I think also the finance piece, it isn't just governments. It is on the companies themselves, including we now have huge unfunding liabilities by oil and gas and tailings. That's not even the transition. That is just literally tailings ponds that is going to be taxpayer liabilities. When we talk about unfunded liabilities, we should say that's on the communities. And so I think we need regulation is important in life. I think that is important to actually set the framework and the expectations, but then you also have to have the incentives. So you do have the incentives, and we talked a lot about this. We don't want everyone in the finance context to just divest, and then they divest the folks who care even less, or the communities are just left with nothing. With stranded assets, with all the costs and no jobs. And so I think that requires a lot of different potential policy tools. Probably at the top, it includes a price on pollution, so that there actually are folks realize you need to clean up things, you're going to save money. But at the other end, really digging deep and figuring out, okay, what incentives are there for folks to help decarbonize and help invest in these communities? And if you don't do that, you will actually be in real trouble, because you got to do everything along the gamut. So, I don't think we have I don't have all solutions. I have some examples of things that didn't work, and then you see great examples, and Sharon will probably talk about that, examples where it really did work, but it's really hard, and it's definitely looking at what works in other contexts, because I think sometimes we're myopic in countries, like, we're the first country to ever deal with this problem. That's not true. And the different stakeholders need to be at the table, because government doesn't always understand, finance and how, what are the different tools to bring in finance. But I also think it's not up to governments themselves to fund the thing. There's just literally not enough money. But if companies have been making tons of profits, it's up to them to also support the communities through the transition.
Very good. Sharon, other thoughts, other countries?
So I'd give you an example of 3 different spots. If you think about, for example, where the American government is now, they've almost skipped over some of that painful piece, because there's been a lot of activism from workers in coal communities and a lot of activism about Indigenous communities around pipelines and land acquisition and so on. But what the IRA does is actually, Reduction Act, is actually generate a lot of money, some of it through grants, but a lot of it through tax credits, which almost means, this is my practical way of explaining this, that actually you get 100 million in tax credits. It means you can basically operate like a charity when you're raising private finance, because the tax credits mean you're effectively not, that your finances are not paying tax or not paying as much tax. And so that's huge in terms of crowding in finance, which we'll come back to. But in that context, what they did is they put the conditionality in the Act. So you actually have to be, first of all, in the American language, union neutral, or you have to have neutrality. So you can't go in and oppose unions organising. There is a government ambition to even be pro-union, as you probably heard in the narrative. But secondly, it is about community benefits. You have to demonstrate for the grants and the tax credits you're provided an actual community benefit more broadly. So it could go to jobs, it could go to development, it could be investment in skills. It's a whole range of potential, or indeed repair of nature, depending on what you think is the community benefit. If you go to Spain, then our lessons were, first of all, I was telling the guys this morning, that the money, Teresa Rivera, in my view, is the best environmental minister, bar Catherine, in the world. And what she did is, built on the kind of experience Catherine just talked about, but it is in fact that she provided the money. She actually did provide the money. However, in the first iteration, it went to local councils. Well, people would think that might be logical in those coal communities, but in fact, it didn't go to the people or the communities that were the coal, were the impact victims, if you like, of the change. And so that created huge tension. So then they built an institution, and the Just Transition Institution now distributes the money with consultations, with applications and so on, a much more, if you like, managed approach to the environment, but inclusive of people. And then the third one is indeed local. And by the way, I now think that unless we move to institutions like the Scottish institution, the work Nick's done on with others in the room on the Just Transition kind of frameworks here, if we can institutionalise that, the Net Zero Economic Authority, I think we called for it in Australia in 2008. I've just gone back to try and live in Australia, and actually it's now being delivered, so there tells you the time lag and the politics. But if we can deliver those institutions where the dialogue is created, the community is then able to see where they can influence the debate. So one more piece, and that is that it's not just national, has to be local and or regional, depending on the choice of the people. But if you're talking about energy precincts, for example, where we have the best chance in many ways of place-based development in generations, then what do you have there? You have clean energy, but you also have a capacity to co-locate other industries, and so that transition out, transition in piece, that, or the economic revolution we're talking about. So you know, in that context, you've got community actors and they all need to be at the table. So it's not just a workplace, it is that. It's not just a community with local government and people in the community setting, it is that. It's not just Indigenous peoples, if they're there as equity partners in land acquisition, etc. But it depends on who are the actors in those communities and how you bring them to the table in genuine partnership to co-create it. So state and national, or provincial and national policy has to work within that framework in supporting that, or we're just not going to get to the scale and pace for it.
Very good. And Amelie, I mean, one of the things we've heard nice examples there of countries in global north taking action on sort of finance and so on. One of the big issues obviously is in developing countries, the lack of fiscal space, lack of investment capital. So your experience as sort of a DFI have been working in some of these countries who are trying to sort of move to net zero, but do that in a way that is making sure that workers aren't left behind, delivering inclusive benefits. What's your sort of things about some of the things that sort of is needed to really make sure that the investment capital flows?
So I think, and first of all, just to explain, we don't engage directly with governments ourselves. So, but we really welcome and recognise the importance of those that do on all of these issues. And I think one of the, I mean, just touching on a couple of points that both Sharon and Catherine made around this element of we talk about transition in, it's relatively straightforward, upskilling, helping create new jobs. The transition out, and this was something fairly early on as we started to really unpack what do we mean by just transition, that we started to realise we had to have a responsible approach to that as well. You know, impact investor, responsible investor. Now, how we've started to think about that, and I think this is, you know, based on some of the points you just made, Catherine, about how do we ensure that where companies are coming in and investing in particular types of fossil fuels is an obvious one, but it won't be only fossil. You know, what we were looking at, so within our portfolio, we have some fossil fuels, and there's, you know, one particular case, heavy fuel oil actually, that we were going to be exiting anyway. Not from a climate perspective, we weren't divesting, but it was the right time to be exiting out. So one of the questions then we started to ask, well, what does that responsible exit look like? Can we sort of almost retroactively require the company to ensure that those workers and communities would have a successful just transition as and when they maybe close down their operations? Now, obviously with hindsight, you know, we would have probably tried to regulate for this from the outset. It's hard to do that, but I do think, you know, if governments are, you know, trying to, if licenses come up for renewal, can you, when you're renewing the licenses, bake in some kind of just transition element there from a regulatory point of view? You know, these are the sorts of issues that I think, you know, we can think about. But what does a responsible exit look like? So I think that's part of it. And again, I think if there's regulation there, that would make it a lot more straightforward. It doesn't have to require regulation, but obviously it requires a responsible investing approach. I think one of the other issues, and this probably, I mean, I like your points about particularly where you start to introduce carbon pricing. How do you introduce those in a way that doesn't have a particularly negative impact on either the poorest consumers or certain types of workers that maybe rely on certain types of, I mean, some examples, my previous job in Latin America, where we saw actually interestingly about trying to shift to electric mobility. You saw a lot of the bus companies started to, you know, and a lot of these companies, you know, they maybe had a license, those licenses were coming up for renewal. It became very clear that the governments themselves had to ensure that there was some way of providing some kind of compensation, if you like, and incentives to enable these new types of bus providers to come in. And we saw examples where that didn't actually, you know, major blockades in the street, literally, street. Equity, that's a famous example. And so it becomes quite clear where you start to introduce these measures, and carbon price in particular, how do you start to distribute that in a way that is more equitable? And I think that's absolutely critical from a public finance perspective, because that then can help incentivize private sector to come in and enable the transition in a way that isn't then necessarily going to be punitive to those who are transitioning out.
Really good. So just a few minutes warning for you in the room to get your questions and comments ready, and also online. We started talking about what's happening at the national level, how just transition is being expressed in different sort of visions of justice. But I think it's clearly this is a priority for international cooperation. We have a just transition work program now at the UN level. This is the year of finance, and the big agreements need to be made at COP this year in terms of mobilizing finance for developing countries. $1 trillion is being talked of as what's being needed for 2030 in terms of international flows of finance to the global south, with some going directly to just transition, but all of that being governed by sort of just transition principles, human rights principles, and so on. So in terms of international cooperation, before we turn to the floor, where would your sort of sense of sort of priorities be in terms of, particularly in the next 6 months in the run-up to COP, where we should be putting our emphasis around getting this tricky but vital issue of just transition really embedded? Sharon, I don't know if you'd like to kick off.
So I'd say, first of all, recognising that at the global level, just transition now is a requirement for governments, thanks to my union colleagues and community friends and others who fought to keep those issues alive. And recognising the origins of just transition being both around workers and the transition for workers and more broadly their communities, because in the Paris Climate Agreement, you had the just transition clause, but you also had a huge fight, which some of us are involved in, to get human rights clause as well. And when you bring those together, it brings some of that those justice questions to the forefront. So it's a much broader challenge than just looking at corporate responsibility or just looking at government responsibility. So first of all, those just transition plans, governments, they'll be vacuous if indeed there isn't a commitment for the whole of the economy to deliver on those. So if they come in and say, we're just going to do 5 coal plants, retire 5 coal plants, that's good, but it's nowhere near enough. If they're not also that, if the NDCs in which they should be embedded are not investable in this, and I think that's a word, but it's used everywhere at the moment. But it's kind of, but if you can't actually parallel the investment, which gets to nix not just the billions, and look at the struggle we got to get to 100 billion and now loss and damage. This is how do you walk on 2 legs? How do you get that good faith foundation? But how do you drive the trillions into this space? And that's where we'll be looking for, I think, as a global community, all of us looking for, ambitious NDCs. And if not, we should be calling them out. But in that context, there's also then a corporate responsibility and an investor responsibility, because if those investors are not actually requiring corporate behaviour that takes the sort of responsibility that you've just heard, and if we're not, if they're calling on the multinational development banks and others to take all of the risk, or governments to take all the risk, or the new narrative that Catherine will expound on, where philanthropy takes the risk, and I go, oh, isn't that a kind of oxymoron, like philanthropy versus if they're investors? Absolutely. But we do need to look at who are the players that can generate the kind of conditionality that means everybody shares in both the risks and the investments. The final thing I'd say about this is I also think we fail to understand how you build collective wealth. we think about governments, yes, they've got a role. We think about corporations and our pension funds and other investors, they definitely have a role. But actually, how did we build pension funds? How did we build cooperatives? How did we build, you know, in my world, you know, we built building societies because banks wouldn't lend to working people, and now they're banks, God forbid, but they're still mutuals. So how do we build those mutual pieces? And Nick, I know, and the team are working with many of our colleagues, including Siwa in India and others, where there's a more community-based development where you can build wealth. And I'm struck by the conversations I had with Indigenous people and Chief Gale, particularly when we were at the OECD, Nick, out of Port Nelson, where they were demanding of your government, not handouts, not grants, although they might be helpful, but they were actually demanding loan guarantees. When they went to the banks or other financial institutions, then they were seen as a major risk, and they weren't going to fund hugely discriminatory, but they weren't going to fund Indigenous development. If you have a loan guarantee from the government, it'd probably never be used. But in fact, it wasn't that big a facility anyway. It was a couple of $100 billion or something. Probably never be used, or a small portion of it will be maybe. But it actually gave them the dignity of getting a loan, building their own businesses and educating their own children in terms of running those businesses. In this case, it was geothermal, by reclaiming old mines, actually. So there's a lot of those stories around the place, and I do think that we do need to demand global wealth invested in this. We do need to demand that banks change their own approaches and other investors, but we also need to say, how do we help communities, often small amounts of money, build collective wealth that can set them up, particularly as we're moving towards things like communities that want to be fully electric, communities that want to have you know, clean cooking and energy foundations to build livelihoods on at both ends of the spectrum. I think we've got more thinking to do about, yes, holding the big players to account, but also saying what are the mechanisms where we can build distributive wealth in order to ensure distributive justice.
Catherine, you were chair of the Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero non-state actors. Integrity Matters, a brilliant readable report looking about how to deal with integrity with net zero across the financial sector, business sector, and cities. And you had included just transition in that. I mean, in terms of sort of international cooperation, where do we need to sort of work harder on the net zero finance and just transition? Any thoughts there before I come to?
I mean, this is such a big topic. I mean, so maybe I'll divide it in just like maybe the way it's going to happen. So COP29 is supposed to be a finance COP. I mean, I don't know. We've been talking about blended finance. I've sat in these conversations for a bazillion years. Like, I'm like, okay, great. There's so much money here, but why isn't it not flowing? So can we just solve this? You're very smart people. It's not my background. I'm not a finance person. I'm a recovering politician, but I mean, I think just the COP, like what is going to have to happen there, you're going to have governments step up on the, like, they call the baby of the 100 billion. I'm like, oh my God. But it's really like governments are going to have to put in their own money, and it can't just be grant. It can't just be loans. Like they have to put in real money. It's trust. It's literally, we are not going to get new targets by countries if we do not see more money. That's just like 100% the thing. And then we do need multilateral development banks. We probably need the philanthropy. I talked about this. I mean, philanthropy, some of the philanthropy, true philanthropy is supposed to get focused on outcomes. So you shouldn't just be getting returns. So maybe you can take a little lower returns. I know some people say they're philanthropy, but they want to actually get amazing returns and take no risk. I'm not entirely sure that's philanthropy. But so we need the risk capital. So that's governments, philanthropy. You need the MDBs, multilateral development banks, to do a much better job. They're not supposed to be crowding out the private sector. They're actually supposed to, I don't think their biggest thing should be the returns they get. I think it should be the outcomes they get, the things they build, the projects that go that wouldn't happen normally. That should be the indicators. The Canada Infrastructure Bank in Canada, we did that. It's a financing vehicle. It looks at how do we get more infrastructure built and looks at outcomes in terms of GHG reductions, indigenous equity participation, a whole bunch of other things that are outcomes. And then you have the private sector. Then you need the new plans. So before COP30, we need to see countries step up with their new plans, and that's important to finance because it is, to be fair to the private sector, I mean, they need some certainty. So they actually need to understand, where's the government going? Are you actually committed to this? Are you going to lurch and then not be committed to it? Is there a long-term plan? Hopefully, I tried to bring a national infrastructure assessment based on net zero by 2050 to talk about, okay, these are huge amounts of money we need. What are our priority projects? How are we going to get it done? What choices are we going to make? But to the net zero piece in the Secretary General's report, I mean, net zero, like discipline is important, including discipline on money. So if you were going to say, ultimately it should all be regulated, and the good news actually, UK is doing a pretty good job there. Europe is regulating double materiality. I hate our language in the climate world, but not just, risk your impact, which we need to be looking at what your impact is. Kind of bonkers to not think about the impact of decisions that companies make and investments they make. And so that our report was really focused on that. But one of the things that is complicated is not just having folks divest. And I know there's a divest movement, and I think divestment in some cases is actually fine, but we do have to be aware that if folks just divest, you're leaving communities. Like, it's easy on your books to say, oh, well, I can reduce my emissions, so I'm just gonna get rid of this asset because it's polluting. Well, who gets the asset? It might just be sitting in the poor communities that, have been providing workers and, all these things to support this company. And the company is like, I'm out of here. And so we do need to make sure that there's frameworks for the financial institutions, but also the companies there to not just do easy things, but to actually take responsibility for the communities and workers that have served their economic interests. And I do think like a broader thing that I think about a lot is fiduciary obligations. So our pensions, a number of them have pushed I don't think it's pushing the limit. Like, I feel like fiduciary obligation should include, if your pension fund, it's workers. And so like, they like to say some pension funds, maybe they're listening in Canada High, but the reality is it's workers' money. Like, so the fiduciary, like, you have to not say we're like the Pope and we don't care, like we're just like pure and we don't care what, the workers whose money it is think about. And actually, there's been some good work done where these pensions actually talk to the pensioners and say, what do you want? And oh, guess what? Many of the pensioners are like, we don't want you investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure. We want to be part of the solution with our money, but we still want returns because this is our pension. And so, I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on, but I think it's actually just having some discipline. And that was why Integrity Matters, you can read it, there's only 10 recommendations, and really the 10th is regulate, so it's only 9 for financial institutions, corporate cities, and regions. But it's actually having outcomes, but every day kind of being disciplined on how you get there. That includes governments mapping it out, but that includes businesses and financial institutions. We need incentives, we need carrots and sticks to get them to do that. But we could, the one good thing, because I see young people here and I feel like, oh my God, if I'm young, I'd be like, oh my God, we're never gonna do this. We can do this. Like, we actually have the solutions, and there's so much money, to be honest. It's just not going to the places and in the ways it needs to go. So we need to make sure that happens. And I think that's a variety of different things, but it's not total rocket science. It just requires people digging a lot deeper.
Very good. So digging a lot deeper with our sticks and our carrots. Just a quick thing on the international cooperation, and we'll
yeah, no. This is actually the perfect segue, and it's almost like we might have rehearsed this, which we didn't really, did we? But actually, and Nick, you mentioned the new quantified collective goal that is being negotiated now, and ideally needs to be agreed in some form. COP29, I imagine, will be further elaborated by COP30. Now that is going to replace the 100 billion commitment, the baby of the 100 billion. Now, that 100 billion, when that was first established, it was, it was quite bold and ambitious at the time. What it did, and I was in a multilateral development bank at the time and seen it from that side and now from the effectively DFI impact investor side. What that incentivized is those that are looking to be part of that 100 billion, looking for big ticket items in what I would say now, primarily in the middle income countries. So we all went out and we did a lot of big renewable energy projects in mature markets. And that was needed then because renewables were not economic, they were not commercial, and actually what it meant, there was a lot of blended finance got brought to many of these countries. That is no longer the challenge anymore, because actually in those countries there are still challenges, but there are different challenges. And what we now need is a framework, a normative framework that incentivizes what I would say a more inclusive climate finance. It needs to incentivize the quality of our climate finance, not just the quantum, and just transition being a core part of that. And so you will hear in the negotiations, there's talk about quality as well as quantity. I did join the very first technical expert dialogue where I was trying to drill this point home. It is very much in there, and this will be quality for just transition, for gender, the gender climate finance nexus. Also, when we think about adaptation finance, we need to think much more about impact of what the investments are doing and the finance is doing than purely trying to measure quantum. So I would say I feel hopeful. I mean, it's creating a normative framework, how quickly that framework can then translate into action. But I do feel that, you know, we're sort of, that's got to be a key part of what happens this year and next year.
And by the way, we have trillions to just repurpose fossil fuel subsidies.
Yeah.
Great. So to the room first, questions and comments. Any thoughts? Please say your name. We have two ladies in that and then in front. So say your names and then ask questions. So take three together.
Okay, so I'm Kate Levick. I'm the Associate Director for Finance and Resilience at E3G. I've got, in time-honoured, boring fashion, I've got a comment and a question. So my comment, I just wanted to bring into the room something that was announced elsewhere earlier this morning, which is that the IFRS Foundation, the International Standards Body for Sustainability Reporting, has taken responsibility for key disclosure products produced by the Transition Plan Task Force, which is wonderful news if you're a sustainability reporting geek. You may not all be. But the reason I just wanted to bring this into the room is because of the work that was done with LSE and the lead on just transition under the Transition Plan Task Force. The Just Transition Working Group, worked to ensure that those TPT products that are being taken up by the IFRS Foundation now had a good amount of just transition in them, about as much as we can fit in, given the Transition Plan Task Force's mandate. And so there is a route for those now sort of feed through to international standards. And, if S2 and climate reporting is built out in the future, but other standards as well, potentially for that to go through. So I think that's potentially exciting, and another iteration of this report might have some of that stuff in it. So I just wanted to put that in. My question is, going back to the original presentation on the report, I was really interested by all the specific examples, things you found. It was very striking to me that talking about justice in the specific text was about sort of mitigation and also about climate vulnerability and impact. And it felt like you had come up with a very broad conception of just transition that included both. I think, where the just transition concept arose from is much more originally around sort of mitigation of fossil fuel and energy economy. And I feel like conversations there, the back and forth. I wondered if anyone wants to comment, especially Jodi-Ann, on how we fit adaptation and resilience into all of this.
So, okay, first, congratulations on your work as co-chair. Welcome. Really, really good, and it's really good to see that now moving from a sort of a UK home into the international architecture. So really, really good on that. Questions. I mean, so one of the challenges I think with just transition is the extent, the scope. You were, talking both about the mitigation, zero side, but also the adaptation resilience. Where's your sense and anybody else about how all of that should be?
I think the way that we in the report wanted to highlight different priorities that different geographies have, and for some geographies, very much that priority will be on the resilience, minimizing vulnerabilities and building resilience side. So I think there's a need to recognize where the just transition discussion first originated from, and give credit to the people that brought that into the mainstream in Paris Agreement. But understandably now, the idea of justice, when we talk about place-based level, for certain places that is strengthening resilience, and that came through in our in our mapping as well, where, you know, for rural communities, for mountain communities, for farmers, that's very much the just transition to those stakeholder groups and the policy levers that have been used and are looking at the resilience.
Very good. Please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kemet. I'm with UNEP FI, where I lead the Secretariat for the Net Zero Banking Alliance. I think some things about climate are super hard because we don't know what we're heading into. You know, a lot of the actual physical climate situations, there's big fans of uncertainty, but I think actually with just transition, it's not in that camp because this is oftentimes it's stuff that we have seen plenty of times before. So just going back to my experience, I grew up in the north of England. So when I was a teenager, we lost all of our coal industry and we didn't have a just transition during that period. And I guess one thing I'm thinking about, I mean, you know, my mother worked a lot with SMEs and sort of trying to get innovation and bring up business development in the region, and it was really hard and it took a long time and it didn't have great results really. One thing that I'm thinking of is the sort of geospatial element that, you know, where a fossil fuel facility closes, it may not be the optimal place for where a renewable place is sited. So I was just wondered if you'd had conversations with communities where it's not necessarily as simple as, okay, we're closing this facility, but we're going to build a big renewables plant. Like, have you had conversations about people having to move? I mean, I think it was it Norman Tebbit in the 80s said, get on your bike? What's the modern day equivalent of that?
Okay, any comments on that? And then we'll take you, John, and then from this side as well, what are any questions? Thanks.
Well, I would just say the company that in philosophy does this best is NL out of Italy, and they understand and by agreement with their workers that there won't always be a one-for-one replacement. I mean, I'm not talking about jobs, I'm talking about industry, so renewables, fossil fuel into renewables. But they also know that if they walk away, there's going to be, if they just walk away, there's going to be a lot of backlash. So they have actually developed a framework for at least facilitating community development hubs. And there's a lot of thought gone into, not so much with the current Italian government, but within regional and national government around, well, what are the advantages? First of all, if you've still got grids, there are switching mechanisms. How do you build on that? What is the capacity for putting some of the industry, battery production, EV, the new industrial settings in those locations? And so it is about economic planning. It's about bringing the community in to economic planning. I would argue even where you're shifting to renewables, co-location of some of those industries is going to provide a much better opportunity for development. And so it's a multi-layered responsibility, but we've all got to have a part in it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, so when we've been looking in South Africa and, you know, most of the coal there is in the Mpumalanga region, and a lot of the new opportunities won't be in renewables there because it's just not, there's not that much renewables there on site. There might be some, but we've been looking at agro processing, yeah, so new forms of economic activity, but it won't be renewables will be probably situated somewhere else that actually in the case of South Africa would bring opportunities to other parts of the country, but not necessarily where the coal mining is. So we need to recognise the social economic development beyond the energy.
I mean, I think this is a very tough question. We were talking about, like, rural Saskatchewan. Now, there actually is a lot of renewals, but interestingly, the governor's very for probably a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and possible interests, but it is hard, right? Like, I think that, and that's why you have to try to make it work. Like, not, I don't know one for one, but these communities, like, you can invest in infrastructure. There are new opportunities, but you have to really work hard because Otherwise, we will have a backlash generally. We already have a hard time. And that's why and from a political perspective, I'll just tell you, it would be like, if you just said, well, actually, we're just gonna close it all down. You know, there was a one point, and we're just gonna do next move. That is true. That has happened by cod fishers in Canada. They went to Fort McMurray. But I don't think that that is a realistic, like, we have to dig extremely deep. And by the way, infrastructure comes in a variety of different ways and opportunities. Like, the economy's changed so much that I think there are ways to do this, but it requires really working with all the partners, from the municipality to the unions to the company to in our case, the federal government, the provincial government, and really thinking, like, how do we make vibrant communities as much as we can, knowing that some people will move anyway, that young people may decide they want to go to a bigger city anyway. But you really have to try, because the worst example is probably what happened in the north in this country. I mean, you know, that causes a huge backlash, and that will really hurt progressive governments.
Yeah.
And like, it will really, really hurt this whole movement if you don't figure it out. And that's true. We see that with JEDPs. It's extremely challenging.
It's just a John Morrison Institute for Human Rights in Business, but I want to sort of ask a very sort of UK question, if that's okay. I went to Sheffield University in the middle of the miners' strike, and so that resonates in my mind, but you might have heard we have an election here next week. Assuming we have a change of government, there are proposals in the manifesto around a sovereign wealth fund, GB energy company, infrastructure authority, a shake up of planning regulation. So all of that is good, right? But Catherine, you already mentioned the sort of the backlash. You can smell it coming. I mean, European parliamentary elections, huge backlash around people who are generally scared about their livelihoods, all the way through to the NIMBYism about the pylons and the renewable energy. Given that the new government has a sort of 100-day window around, you know, regulation, what advice would you give an incoming government here about regulating for trust? What mechanisms could be put in place to build the trust that you're all talking about, and the co-creation that we know we need, and digging deep, and it's difficult. Given this window, what could be put in place by a new government to enable those things to happen and not to repeat the 1980s?
Anybody want to take that one? And then we'll take Isabel.
I'll say
Any
something
others?
contradictory. I mean, if you have 100 days, the one thing I learned in Canada is use those 100 days. You get a huge majority. I'm sorry, like you just got to do things because it takes so long. At the same time, I think you got to figure out where are the wins, because there are things we were just talking about. If whoever's in the room about the North. The North probably wants infrastructure. They're probably less likely to be into NIMBYism. Like, you know, I mean, you got to listen to folks, but I think, you know, MPs actually have some good sense of their communities. And I think try to figure out where your wins are. Of course, you need a process of consultation. The only thing I would say about consultation, and you have to do consultation, but you can't do it in 100 days. So that's your challenge. You got to do things because people are like, are you useless? And you have a window where you've got a lot of goodwill. You don't want to burn the goodwill, but you will look like you're incompetent if you can't get some things done, and then you want to get wins. So that is the challenge of governing. It's a good challenge, by the way. It's an awesome challenge to have, to be in the position to do that. But there are wins. And by the way, infrastructure does take a long time to build in these cases, but there's nothing people like more. To be honest, good infrastructure. Like the biggest thing I ever did, and it's hilarious because we did massive bridges, was a footbridge in my community. Like everyone talked about this footbridge because they connected a whole bunch of different communities, made shorter commute times for people. Like so I think there are wins, but people, you have to not be a bureaucracy. You can't have the bureaucratic mindset that we just have these processes and do all these things. You won't get things done, and you actually won't listen to people. But the only other thing I would say is start building coalitions of people. Like farmers want climate action. What do they want? Like, so figure out, don't always talk like a climate person, just like regular people, what do they want? Or talk about air quality, talk about those benefits and get coalitions of people that support it, so that support the government. Unusual suspects, even better, you can do that.
But I would say combine finance guarantees, i.e. infrastructure or other areas, with the promise of, co-creation. Yeah. Because the NIMBYism is about, a it's not so much about a breakdown in trust that comes from deeply scarred communities, but it is about self-interest, and where you can involve whole communities with processes where they see they're going to be involved. Often the transactional social license, that is, I'm going to buy out this bit of land from you and you're going to make a lot of money, but I'm going to ignore all the values of land on agriculture around it, is avoided. And when you've got community, not individuals or not one category of individuals, then you're going to build that trust. But infrastructure and the promise and the delivery of genuine consultation on how that money is going to be actually distributed.
Great non-partisan responses. Fantastic. Rowan, are there any questions online?
There are. I mean,
I'm gonna
I
take
go
a
on.
couple here, but then,
I would say there's probably 3 that we could come to.
okay, please, Isabel, and then Shweta.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Isabel, and I work in one of those multilateral summit speaking about in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development here in London. So back in the day, a few years ago, I launched the Just Transition Initiative, which was focused a lot on miners and workers and how do we help those communities, fossil fuel sectors and so on. Now, it seems to me that the conversation has moved on a bit. So, for example, looking at the European elections, it is a hugely divisive issue now, keeping the climate commitments and so on. And in my view, it's not only about workers, it's about what you called before, Sharon, distributional justice. So some people feel that the green economic transition costs a lot and it's leaving them behind. And this is a completely different type of response that I think it requires. People who think that electric vehicles cost a fortune and why are they taking away my car when I cannot afford a new one? Or why are they putting a new regulation on energy efficiency in buildings when I don't have the money for a triple glazed window, for example? So it's a reflection, but also a question to the panel. How do we tackle that, this different type of just transition?
Yeah. Anybody wants to come on to the distributional, please?
I just think it is absolute. If you take the European context, you've got to move from not to give up the Green Deal. We're all out there supporting our European sisters and brothers to preserve it, but translating it into green industrialisation, because that's where communities are at. Where are the jobs? Where's the investment? Where's the capacity for us to see hope? But it's also about new models. So if you're going to retrofit communities, for example, for all electric communities, you can get, I've seen it, you can build community. It's like organising workers. You can get communities who really want this, but you have to have the financial models. So there's a very bad piece of financial architecture in the way it's used in Australia, called our loans for students in universities, where they're actually free until you actually reach a certain level. If you finance some of this transition, but in fact you don't actually require payments back until you've lowered the cost of energy because of the renewable and the retrofit, then that's a very different story. So we need to look at creativity as well as the hope of, a new model of industrialisation that is absolutely vital.
I'm going to take Shweta, I think, and then take people online, and then we'll wrap up.
So I'm Shweta Srinivasan. I represent the India Climate Collaborative. We're a multi-donor kind of philanthropic fund seeking to really support ecosystem-based approaches for just transition. My question is more in terms of, as you look at the entire ecosystem and you look at the community-based economic diversification side of it, as well as the national architecture and the businesses, there's also this one middle path, which is in terms of how governance or industrialization has been supported in countries in the global south, where the role of public sector enterprises becomes pretty important. And there's a lot of conversation going on right now in terms of the control these public sector enterprises have, as well as how much can they be involved in this just transition process. Coal India Limited, for example, has subsidiary level just transition task forces. But even with that thinking, there is kind of breakage in the linkage between the community level engagement and what these public sector enterprises are doing. So I guess my question to the three of the panelists is really in terms of how have you seen the engagement with fossil fuel based public sector enterprises who actually were facing towards regional economic development for the last 30 years?
Great question. Anybody want to take that?
Gosh, I mean, they should be all on board. Like in a way, you think, well, the public sector should be in line with the government's priorities, although we don't always see that, and sometimes incentives are extremely hard because of the way we've structured our economy. Like we've seen this when we're trying to move off fossil fuels, that then suddenly your base, if you go say you retrofit every home and everyone gets a heat pump, well, what's their base, right? Then the few people that don't have a heat pump, they're trying to make money and make the things work. So I think I mean, ideally, there'd be the government, you know, they'd be working hand in hand with the government would help create the right incentives. I don't have great examples. Maybe Sharon?
Two examples, and one is that in Singapore, for example, they've just put up the carbon tax, essentially. It's still at 45, a bit low, but nevertheless, they've pledged to reinvest that in both technology and people. So it goes to some of those questions, and they have the kind of government architecture that can actually be held accountable. So that's one model where you're redistributing, you know, government funding. The other one is more on the community thinking about those companies who know that if they don't move, they're going to be stranded assets. So I was talking about an impossible task, but nevertheless, you go to Malaysia, Petronas is 20% of the GDP in Malaysia, but so much of the economy outside of just that 20% depends on it. And so consequently, they're seeing that they have to have a target for transference of CapEx, and they've got a target of 30% by 2030. I don't think they'll meet it. It's not to be reported, but I think their intentions are good, and they want to know how to do it with just transition. So some of that is about saying, well, where's the government, because they are a government entity by any means, where's the government mechanisms that do what you want to do to see that there's still an income stream that's contributing to GDP, but actually is people-centred?
Good. Questions?
So the first question here is from Max Schmidt from Perspectives Climate Research. He says, the high-level overview is much appreciated. However, could you please shed some more light specifically on the African continent, where currently two, maybe opposing just energy transition partnerships have been agreed, with South Africa having a coal wind down and Senegal a renewable scale up. Where are other African countries heading to?
Hey, any comments? We've got a South African in a room, I think, Chantal. I don't know if you... Chantal, do you want to comment?
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, we've done a little bit of work on the fact that on the continent there are different types of transitions underway. And I think the first, before you can think about a just transition, you need to think about the relationship that different countries on the continent actually have with fossil fuels. Because it's not just a wind up and down or scale up. In the case of South Africa and Senegal, there's also some who have got, you know, fossil fuel that are still in the ground and what constitutes trust in that context. And then layering it through that to get to a quality and quantity of finance question, also you need to ask the question about environmental ambitions of the policymakers in those countries. For example, in South Africa, the environmental and social ambition is really high because of the impact of their relationship with fossil fuels, but in some countries, it's not so much an environmental impact, but there's a social justice element that is always big. And the sad reality for a lot of the GPs is that there's a high quantity of finance promised. To Amelie's point earlier, is a very low quality of finance underpinning all of it. And to Sharon's point earlier about dignity, and it's so amazing hearing you say that the dignity of finance is actually first. So I think that the narrative of the just transition is doesn't really work for many African countries, to be honest. That isn't livelihoods, you know, and not even justice, but just the true dignity, are more important words than the concept of just transition. How they translate into, you know, a financing term sheet or a package, at the end of the day will be dependent on what it looks like at face base.
Depends on the actors. You're right, absolutely 100%. But we have worker communities, and if you take Senegal, it's actually the sheer hypocrisy of the development, but with all those questions about justice you talk about, because they are bringing on stream the first fossil fuel delivery in this year and the coming years, while they're also taking money for JETPs, which are actually, I think it's about 11, I've forgotten the number, of sites for renewable development. They signed the Just Transition Energy Principles, which were developed collectively under the auspice of the IEA commission, but went to the Glasgow COP. But when I was there last year, they hadn't consulted anybody. They hadn't consulted the unions, they hadn't consulted the communities. So there's a terrible lack of coherence around these questions. And the other one is, if we're serious about trade and we want to shift genuine development models, then if you look at the fact that Germany's got what we call an offtake agreement around delivery of green hydrogen from Nigeria. But my question would be, is it delivered, and will other nations deliver into Africa, Asia, Latin America, the shared IP, the financing of that, the just transition processes that leave that kind of dignity and trust in the outcomes? And I think the jury's way out on that.
Sorry, Chantal. Please.
Coupled at the moment is strategic and green minerals, and that is the whole coupling of the decoupling of, you know, from a negotiating and trade perspective of what resources for climate, but it's also got an asset base. And I think there's a completely undignified relationship happening between the asset base, beneficiation, the potential of the continent, which for renewable energy is immense, but less than 1% of that is actually being emphasized on the continent. So the continent actually needs resources for itself, but a lot of the strategies around green minerals have to demonstrate what is just.
Fantastic, Rowan.
I mean, we're at time,
Yeah.
so this is a big question, and I would suggest it's the last. There've been calls, this is from Vasco Basak, there've been calls for the UK to contribute trillions of pounds to other countries, which is many times the UK's gross domestic product. In view of the current state of the UK's public finances and domestic priorities, how can we determine what is fair and sustainable, especially when it relates to historical issues from generations ago, and who or what determines justice and what is just? I mean, that's a gigantic question.
That might be something when we finish, but maybe one of the things as a British citizen for the first 100 days is probably to reassert the UK's climate finance commitments as a priority. I think would be one thing. Any comments on that before we close?
I mean, the only thing is probably it's just a broader point, because I was really thinking about this piece. I mean, what is so important, like with this, to your question about how do you get communities on side and the backlash, I just think that you do people-centered policy. So I'm doing a little plug, but in Canada, we brought in carbon pricing. It's revenue neutral, which is actually progressive because people that get the most money back don't have large houses. They rely on public transit. You know, so there are ways of doing things, but even on the infrastructure side, where the US was very good at this, they actually required unionized workers. They actually prioritize disadvantaged communities, and they have frameworks to do that. So while you don't decide all the projects, you actually show that you care about people. And some of those don't require massive consultations because they're kind of up here, and then they will go to the communities to determine those. But you will not, like, this is the one thing where it would all fall apart. Thank you for talking about the South African context or the African context generally, because it's often like the Western view of you know, how these policies or how these things translate or what is actually happening. I think sometimes is very challenging And I say this for Canada, we are a huge exporter of fossil fuels. We talk about how we're reducing our emissions at home. Well, and then we don't contribute a ton of money when it comes to finance, whether it's, loss and damages, which we are contributing to obviously as a historical emitter, but also to adaptation and to transition money that the countries need. So I think, but anyway, huge questions, but I think really, it's really great that people are thinking very deeply about them here.
Great. Last word to Jodi-Ann.
Too much pressure. I just want to bring it back to what Chantal you just said, the second point you made about the extractive nature of the global socio-economic system, and that the just transition is happening when the system is unjust, right? So it's about undoing the harms and then looking forward. And we saw that really clearly in the just transition work program dialogue this year, where there are countries that are only looking forward at what needs to happen, and there are countries that are saying, wait a second, but like I have been historically disproportionately impacted by this for so long. We're talking about financing, but there's net transfer of wealth from developing countries to developed countries each year. And that is your extractive sector, that is the exporting of these technologies without the capacity building back into the large consumer base. And so at the end of the day, and in our report we touch on that, the justice implications for developed countries to compromise endogenous thought and leadership on what justice means to those communities in the first place. Otherwise, we risk having a just transition narrative that's not for the benefit.
Yeah, can I just say what
Yeah.
a team? Just what a team. I know, Catherine, I can probably speak for you, but we're so proud to be associated with the lab when it can deliver that kind of professional framing for this kind of discussion. So to all the team and Jodi-Ann, but to Nick and Rowan, thank you very much.
Thank you. On a team, we have Georgia Davis and others in the team who've really helped make this possible. And I'd like to thank all the partners who helped us in this, our funding funders, and so thank you very much for this. This is designed to air issues. I think the theme of sort of the dignity of finance that Chantal you raised, as well as justice, is very important. We now have the opportunity for some cool drinks, hopefully outside, so we can outside this room, so we can close the video Zoom.